It's just after sunset, and you've been handed a glass of horchata by the waiter in the trackside cafe by the town square. The ground is still hot, but the temperature in the Sonoran Desert drops rapidly after dusk. In the distance, you hear a steam locomotive whistle, something you haven't heard back at home for years. Around the bend comes a heavy 282 Mikado with a long freight train in tow. The earth shakes under the weight of the train as it rumbles through the small town. The dimly lit caboose creaks past as you take another sip, and the roar fades away into the Mexican night. Welcome to the Alta California Railway in 1968. My HO scale layout was an 8 by 15 foot model railroad that filled a third of my workshop. It came to fruition in tandem with my concept for a prototype freelance Class 1 railroad. The overall concept was basically, what if James Fair hadn't sold the South Pacific coast to the Southern Pacific in 1888, but instead rallied investors to build the line to Mexico? While another forthcoming video series will cover the lore, the important part here is that the layout concept models two drastically different scenes, hundreds of miles apart from each other. One half of the donut depicts West Oakland, California in 1968, a vibrant neighborhood in the throes of meaningful change thanks to the efforts of the Black Panthers and other groups. Emeryville is the northern terminus for the Alta, capturing the distinctive street-running scenes of both passenger and freight trundling down the fictional Manzanita Avenue. The other half of the layout is set hundreds of miles south of Oakland, near Puerto Penasco in Mexico. This dusty seaside resort town got railroad service 50 years before the Sonora, Baja California would have been built in 1940. Thus, the town is larger and more prosperous than it was in real life. These scenes frame the Alta concept pretty well, showing what two different divisions of the railroad looked like. Mexico retired mainline steam in 1968 on the NDM, and so did the Alta, so you have a fascinating mix of second-generation diesels running with ancient steam, a scene virtually impossible elsewhere in North America, as mainline steam ended in 1959. The idea of ST-45s and high-cube boxcars running alongside tea-kettle 440s with wooden cabooses holds a strong appeal to me. Thus, the Alta was born. The first step was building it. I moved into my workshop back in 2009, living on my own as an adult at 19 in a live-work space in an artist colony, and it was an incredible experience. I bought salvaged materials from my previous layout, a prototype freelance layout based on the Andy Sperandio's San Jacinto branch track plan for Model Railroader. The layout was my first quote-unquote serious layout. It wasn't just a rough 4x8 piece of plywood. I filled the garage space in the 1920s home I used to live in with my parents. Sometime in 2012, I got a wild hair to build some Fremo modules that would capture a generic West Oakland look, modeling the fictitious Inner Harbor Terminal Railway. I painted up a Baldwin VL1000 and SW1 in the handsome scheme, inspired by the Dardanelle and Russellville scheme. Initially, I overbuilt them to Fremo standards, using Baltic birch plywood and building the two-track modules to the specified 26-inch width. I even had the PC board end plates in place, which were insanely expensive to purchase. And I never ended up using the functionality of taking the modules apart and putting them back together. Once the track was in for the modules, I foolishly didn't add any switches to the street running portion, which killed any operational interest. The street was a flawed mixture of Durham's water putty and Sculptamold. In retrospect, I wouldn't use the Durham's water putty for street trackage as it didn't take pigment resiliently. I connected up the Fremo modules to the remaining parts of my layout and kind of had a half-assed layout for a few years, which didn't really see any operation and mostly collected dust. Remember kids, continuous running is important for layout enjoyment. Without it, the entire layout maybe got 8 to 10 hours of runtime over a period of years. A while later, the original San Jacinto modules were demolished, and all the lumber that could be salvaged was, while the rest met its fate. In 2015, Tom Coletti and I hatched a plan. We'd save up money to buy materials, and he'd come up from college to do a barn raising, in which we would go from an empty room to a fully operational layout in less than a week. We did 2 days of slapdash woodworking with salvaged lumber we found, followed by track laying. It ended up working extremely well, and the Alta Mark I was born. The main features I wanted were my first double-track mainline ever with sweeping curves wide enough for 85-foot passenger cars and piggyback flat cars. The curves worked out to about 32 and 34-inch radius curves, respectively, albeit not as smooth as I had hoped, but more on that later. Plenty of switching for operational interest would be the cornerstone of the new plan. One of the original ideas was to incorporate the handsome border inspection facility at Mexicali, but that never came together. I also wanted a river, which was a signature scene on the San Jacinto layout as well. Scenery came in fits and starts over the next few years. I was burned out on modeling and closed the first version of my model making business in 2014. I went off to college not long after, and most of my time was vacuumed up, doing industrial design projects, getting entangled in a typical Bay Area startup, and other parts of my life. Graduating in 2018, I freed up some time to work on the layout again, but I also filled my time with other pursuits. Around the time I made the first intro video for Interurban Era back in April 2019, I had lots to look forward to as I settled into a model-making production rhythm. The layout was to become my canvas for scenery projects and testing out client projects. I leaned into improving the layout, doing the first version of the town of Esquina over the next year or two in between client projects. As you're familiar with, it became the backdrop for a lot of run-by videos, as it was the only finished part of the layout. The Oakland side was languishing because the sheer time it took to scratch build and kit bash structures was time away from doing lucrative client projects, time I couldn't afford back then. At the time, I was juggling industrial design projects and a new client's 14 by 42 foot garage layout, link to it in the description. My client inspired a deep dive into the state-of-the-art layout construction practices, vastly refining my own skills. This was coupled with my honed attention to detail I accrued while in design school. Once I'd completed the benchwork for my client's new layout, I went home, and suddenly my hastily built home layout from another time in my life just did not meet my own quality standards. There was only one problem: a layout built on poor foundation, a very old salvaged warped lumber, and hastily laid track turned into a rough running time. One module sagged in the middle so badly the cars uncoupled. The outer donut had improperly kiln-dried green lumber that warped more each year. I fixed what I could, and then the pandemic hit. Lumber prices soared, and I didn't want to risk exposure grabbing stuff from the lumberyard. In 2021, I rebuilt the saggy module with all new track. I ripped up the street running portion I'd made in 2013, and I worked with a friend to redesign the Fremo module portion of the layout to be more fun to operate. This temporary fix was only a band-aid, but it definitely felt great to have the Oakland side track plan nailed. It was fun to operate, it had great photo ops, and felt right. This repair ushered in the golden age of running trains. The rise of the YouTube shorts I've done over the last year or so with run-bys is precisely because it ran very well. That breathed new life into the desire for me to do new scenery on the layout, and we began planning on expanding the Mexican corner town even more. Esquina, as it was to be known, grew after we rebuilt the highway to 1960s engineering standards. I began seeking out desert foliage. Luckily, the region I'm modeling is the Sonoran Desert, home to the iconic saguaro cactuses like you'd find in Looney Tunes. These cast resin examples came from Germany. After searching through thousands of kits, none really looked even close to accurate for Mexico, so I began scratch building the correct structures, inspired by Google Street View, old postcards, and photos of the region. I made extra sure that anything I was building would have been there in 1968 as well to avoid anachronisms. Made from sheet styrene and Campbell corrugated metal siding, they came together satisfyingly quickly. I could usually build an entire home in 1 to 2 modeling sessions. All was well until I began doing a shakedown run of a recently completed modeling project, the Greenbrier Presidential Express, teased here in this mockumentary. The entire train was comprised of Walther's Proto passenger cars. The hastily laid curves in 2015 were done without track sweeps and therefore not a perfectly consistent radius. This led to a variety of pinching and jackknifing on even the larger radius curves. Realizing that the heart of the Alta concept is prototypical length passenger trains, long 89-foot piggyback flat cars, and other long equipment, it would take more than a casual fix. Back in 2015, I laid the main line using Alex adhesive caulking, which actually worked very well, but once it dried, it kept all the imperfections in the track work to rear its ugly head years later. Using a metal spatula and destroying the flex track was the only solution, sadly. As I popped up an entire curve, I realized that the caulking left a lot of goop all over the roadbed, so it was a task to remove the roadbed, which really didn't work since wood glue does its job and bonds the cork to the plywood extremely well. I was at a crossroads: break my wrist sanding down an old layout, or to build a new. Its presence in my workshop was impossible to ignore. Thanks to my clients and my viewers on here, I now have the resources to do it correctly all at once. This layout has been with me in various forms for over a decade. I learned an incredible amount with it. I learned a lot about myself as well. You wouldn't be watching this video today if it weren't for this layout. It was a constant reminder to keep pushing my art, my skills, my craft. That's the warm and determined energy I plan to pour into Alta Mark too, and this will begin a long-running layout construction series in tandem with those of my clients. This new series will be much more personal, more in-depth. Hopefully you'll learn new things alongside me as I begin building this new layout. I won't spoil much of anything about what I'm planning with this new layout, but I will say that we're still modeling Alta in 1968 in Mexico. Also, for the first time ever, there will be interurbans. Stay tuned for that and many other future videos. This has been An Urban Era. Thank you and goodbye.